Oak Island treasure found. History Channel confirms the discovery. Somewhere off the coast of Nova Scotia sits a small, unremarkable island that has swallowed more money, more machinery, and more human lives than almost any patch of dirt on Earth. For 231 years, people have been digging into it, drowning in it, and dying for it. 6 men have lost their lives chasing whatever is down there. And right now, headlines and thumbnails all over the internet are screaming that the hunt is finally over, that the treasure has been found, that History Channel has confirmed it. So before you get your hopes up or write this off as another hoax, let's actually look at what has come out of that ground, what hasn't, and what the record really says as of this year. Because the true answer is stranger and more interesting than either the headlines or the skeptics want to admit. To understand why this question even matters, you have to go back to the beginning. In the summer of 1795, a teenage boy named Daniel McGinnis was exploring the eastern end of Oak Island, back when it was still wild and mostly untouched. He came across a strange clearing in the woods, a circular depression in the earth, roughly 13 feet across, like the ground had sunk after something was buried and covered back over. Above it, hanging from the sawed-off limb of an old oak tree, was a ship's tackle block, the kind of pulley rigging sailors used to lower heavy loads. To a boy raised on stories of pirates prowling that coastline, the message seemed obvious. He came back the next day with 2 friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and they started to dig. What they found convinced them they were onto something real. 2 feet down, they hit a layer of flagstones that don't occur naturally on the island. Someone had carried them there. The pit walls showed clear pick marks. And every 10 feet, they struck a solid platform of oak logs wedged into the shaft and sealed with clay. They dug through platform after platform until the work became too dangerous for 3 boys with hand tools, but they never let it go. Almost a decade later, in 1804, an organized expedition called the Onslow Company returned with real manpower and equipment, and they kept finding the same thing. Platform after platform of oak, every 10 feet, exactly as the boys had described. Then they started finding stranger material packed between the layers, a layer of charcoal, a layer of putty, and a thick mat of coconut fiber, on an island hundreds of miles from anywhere a coconut has ever grown. Whoever built this had access to materials from across an ocean. At around 90 feet, the diggers reportedly found a flat, inscribed stone covered in symbols nobody on site could read. The night they believed they'd struck a chest at the bottom, the pit flooded with roughly 60 feet of water almost overnight, and no matter how hard they pumped, the water held steady at sea level. It would take years before anyone understood why. The pit appeared to be connected to the ocean itself through a network of engineered flood tunnels, feeding in through an artificial filter bed at nearby Smith's Cove. This wasn't a simple hole with a chest dropped into it. This was a structure. Someone had studied the tides, moved Earth on a massive scale, and built in a defense mechanism that could drown anyone who dug too deep, too fast. From there, the story becomes 2 centuries of the same pattern repeating. New companies formed, new shafts were sunk, and the island kept fighting back. In 1849, a drilling crew using a horse-powered auger reportedly pulled up fragments described as loose metal in pieces and later claimed to find a few small links of gold chain clinging to the drill. That detail, unverified, possibly exaggerated in the retelling, but never fully dismissed either, is what turned Oak Island from a local curiosity into an international obsession. Company after company followed for the rest of the 19th and 20th centuries. Dynamite, steam pumps, new shafts dug alongside the old ones, attempts to dam the cove and cut off the flood tunnels at the source. Each attempt collapsed, flooded, or ran out of money. By the early 1900s, so many competing shafts had been dug and redug that the original 1795 pit was essentially lost inside a churned mess of collapsed tunnels. The searchers had destroyed the very landmark they were chasing. Then came the tragedy that gave the legend its darkest chapter. In August 1965, Robert Restall, his teenage son Bobby, and 2 other men, Carl Grazer and Cyril Hiltz, were overcome by toxic gas while working in a shaft near Smith's Cove and died within the pit. 2 more searchers had died in earlier decades. That brought the total to 6 lives lost chasing whatever lies beneath Oak Island. And it's why the old local saying, that 7 must die before the treasure gives itself up, still gets repeated with a chill instead of a laugh. For most of Oak Island's history, that's basically where the story stood. Dramatic, tragic, and almost entirely built on word of mouth. Every serious theory about who built the pit and why ran into the same wall, pirates like Captain Kidd didn't have the time or resources to engineer a tidal flood trap. The Knights Templar theory, which imagines the medieval order shipping treasure across the Atlantic 2 centuries before Columbus, is dramatic but rests on very little hard evidence. The idea that Francis Bacon buried proof he secretly wrote Shakespeare's plays is a fun conspiracy but has never been substantiated. For 200 years, Oak Island was a locked room that nobody had actually opened, and every theory was just a story people told about the outside of that door. What's changed, and this is the part most of the viral headlines skip right past, is the type of searching being done. Since 2006, brothers Rick and Marty Lagina have run what is by far the most heavily resourced Oak Island operation in its history, and their team has brought in tools the earlier treasure hunters never had. Ground-penetrating radar to read what's under the soil without digging blind, seismic surveys to map voids and density changes deep underground, sonar to visualize flooded chambers, and careful core drilling that pulls up thin, undisturbed samples of Earth, so geologists and archaeologists can study them layer by layer instead of just tearing the ground open and hoping. For the first time in 2 centuries, searchers could ask questions about what's down there before committing to another expensive, dangerous dig. And the ground has actually answered, just not with a chest of gold. Laboratory testing on wood pulled from deep in the Money Pit area, run by researchers including Dr. Ian Spooner and Dr. Fred Michel, has found trace gold and silver readings in both water samples and recovered wood, with one sample pulled from a shaft in 2024 returning some of the highest metal readings recorded on the island to date. That's not proof of a treasure chest, but it is a real, tested signal that metal has moved through that ground at some point. Alongside that, the team has recovered actual coins spanning roughly 5 centuries, Spanish coppers from the 1590s and 1650s, a Spanish silver coin from the 1780s, British coins from the 1700s, and even a handful of Roman-era coins whose presence on the island nobody has been able to explain. There have been pieces of jewelry, too. Brooches set with garnets and glass gems dated to as early as the 14th century, a lead cross whose composition suggests it could be as old as 900 to 1300 AD, and a small gold cross tied to the family of Daniel McGuinness himself, dated to the 1500s or 1600s. None of these are individually of fortune. Together, there's something almost stranger. Physical proof that people of real means were leaving valuable objects on this island across an enormous span of history, centuries before any recorded population is supposed to have been there. So, has anyone actually found the treasure? Has History Channel confirmed a discovery? Here's the honest, sourced answer, because you deserve the truth more than you deserve the clickbait. No. As of this year, no chest, no vault, and no hoard has been lifted out of Oak Island. Nobody has stood in front of a camera and unveiled the fortune the legend has promised for 231 years. What the most recent season of digging did produce was described as the most artifact-rich year in the show's history, with researchers cataloging well over 1,000 individual finds across the island, but every single one of them is a fragment, a coin, a trace, or a clue, not the prize itself. At the close of that season, Marty Lagina placed a single 1-ounce gold coin at the site the team plans to dig next, marking it as a target rather than a discovery. That's the most literal gold moment the show has actually had recently, and it was the team's own coin, not something pulled from the earth. Filming for the next season has already begun, with new digging expected to resume later this year. It's also worth understanding why nothing has been recovered yet, because the reasons aren't mysterious or covered up. They're mostly just physics and history working against every searcher who's tried. The flood system that trapped the 1804 crew still functions today in some form. Water continues to be one of the single biggest obstacles to reaching the original structure. A major collapse in 1861 dropped the bottom of the old workings into a void, possibly taking whatever was down there even deeper. And 2 centuries of overlapping shafts, tunnels, and collapsed excavations have so thoroughly disturbed the original site that simply relocating the exact 1795 pit has become its own research project. The most recent major engineering push, a steel caisson sunk during the last season of digging, reached bedrock at 210 feet, but came up short of its planned depth, pulling up 19th-century drill pipe, twisted iron, and a piece of stained wood that researchers noted has no obvious reason to be sitting that deep. In other words, the modern team isn't just digging for old treasure, they're digging through the wreckage of 150 years of other people's failed attempts to find it first. There's also a legal side to this that clickbait headlines never mention. Nova Scotia has its own law specifically governing Oak Island, the Oak Island Treasure Act, which requires any recovery to go through a licensed, archaeologically supervised process. That's why a professional archaeologist is present for the excavation work, and it's part of why any genuinely significant find gets documented and reviewed rather than simply pulled out of the ground and shown off. If something enormous is ever recovered, it won't be a surprise unveiling on social media. It'll come with paperwork, provincial oversight, and a documented process attached to it. So, where does that leave the mystery? Stripped of the hype, here's the real, current state of it. Nobody has recovered the fortune, and no network has confirmed that they have. What does exist is a genuinely large and growing body of tested, dated physical evidence. Trace gold, 5 centuries of coins, medieval jewelry, an unexplained flood engineering system, and wood and metal readings that keep pointing towards something worth investigating further. That's not nothing. It's arguably more interesting than a single treasure chest would be, because it suggests a much longer and stranger history of activity on that island than anyone assumed when this all started with 3 boys and a shovel in 1795. But it is not confirmation of a discovery, and anyone telling you otherwise, especially with a thumbnail promising a vault has been unearthed, is selling you a headline, not reporting a fact. That gap between what people want to believe and what has actually been proven is, in a lot of ways, the real story of Oak Island. It's the reason this hunt has survived financial ruin, repeated failure, and the deaths of 6 men without ever losing believers. Every fragment that comes up out of the ground is real enough to keep the legend alive, and incomplete enough to keep the argument going. The skeptics have a fair point when they note that a coin or a chain link isn't a fortune, and that after 2 centuries you'd expect more concrete proof if something enormous really were down there. The believers have a fair point too, when they ask why anyone would go to the trouble of engineering a tidal flood defense system just to protect nothing. Both sides are looking at the same evidence and drawing very different conclusions from it, and until something conclusive actually comes out of that ground, that argument isn't going anywhere. What's changed permanently, though, is the quality of the evidence itself. This isn't campfire folklore passed down for 200 years anymore. It's carbon dating, metals analysis, numismatic identification, and documented excavation records, all of it publicly tracked and updated as new seasons of digging happen. The mystery hasn't been solved, but it has moved from pure legend into something closer to an open scientific question, with real data attached to it. And that, more than any single artifact, might be the most significant development in the entire 231-year history of the search. So, if you came here because a headline told you the Oak Island treasure has been found and confirmed, now you know the real answer. Not yet, not officially, and not in the way those thumbnails promise. What has been found is enough to keep serious researchers digging, enough to keep funding a new season of excavation, and enough to keep this the longest-running treasure hunt in recorded history. Whether the next shaft, the next caisson, or the next core sample finally reaches whatever is down there is still an open question. If you want to be around when that answer finally comes, subscribe, because whatever is buried under those oaks isn't giving itself up without a fight, and this story is far from finished.